4,000 people in eastern China were handed one job this weekend, and it has almost nothing to do with the ocean. They are watching hillsides. More than 7,500 of them, slopes above villages, cut banks behind schoolyards, road embankments carved into soft, weathered rock that has already been soaking up rain for 2 days. 4,000 pairs of eyes standing in the wind, looking uphill, because the people who run disaster response in Zhejiang province understand something that most of the headlines about Typhoon Dolphin have skipped right over. The thing coming ashore tonight is not, first and foremost, a windstorm. I want to be careful with that sentence, because Dolphin brings dangerous wind, and I'll give you the exact numbers in a moment. But if you want to understand why the forecasters who do this for a living are tense tonight, you have to stop staring at the eye and start looking at the ground. The size of this system, its speed, its timing, and the terrain it is about to climb all point in the same direction. They point at water. This channel exists to give you the real version of events like this one, in plain language, while they're still happening. Subscribe and you'll have the landfall numbers as they come in. Instead of finding out what happened 3 days later, here's where Dolphin sits as I record this. The center is in the East China Sea, a few hundred kilometers off the coast, crawling west-northwest toward a stretch of shoreline between Zhoushan and Zhejiang province and Fuding in northern Fujian. That is the landfall corridor issued by China's National Meteorological Center, and it puts the center coming ashore somewhere in the neighborhood of 370 kilometers south of Shanghai, roughly 230 miles. The timing window runs from late tonight into tomorrow morning. Near the center, forecasters expect sustained winds of 38 to 45 meters per second. Translate that out of the technical units and you get something between 85 and 101 miles per hour. That is a genuine, structure-damaging typhoon coming into one of the most densely built coastlines on Earth. And Dolphin is moving slowly. Over the past several hours, it has been tracking at around 13 kilometers per hour. That's about 8 miles per hour. A person on a bicycle would keep pace with it. Before that, it did something stranger. It looped. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center described a slow, wobbling, trochoidal motion, with the system completing a full cyclonic loop and then decelerating, meandering out there in the East China Sea before settling onto its final westward run. Hold that image, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. A storm that stalls offshore is a storm that gets to spend extra hours pouring water into the same places. So how did a typhoon end up out there looping in the first place? To answer that, you have to go back roughly 2 weeks and about 7,000 kilometers east. Dolphin was born in a part of the Pacific where typhoons are not supposed to be born. It formed near the international date line, out past the Marshall Islands, in open water so far from Asia that most systems that develop there either die of loneliness or curve harmlessly north into the empty ocean. Dong Lin, chief forecaster at the National Meteorological Center, said that a typhoon forming that far east, near the date line, and then going on to strike China has never been documented since Chinese meteorological records began. The team at Yale Climate Connections put it in a different frame. Dolphin is the strongest typhoon on record to develop that close to the dateline. Think about the distance for a second. This system crossed most of the width of the Pacific Ocean. It has been alive since late July. It survived cooler water, dry air, and a subtropical ridge that could have flung it out to sea at half a dozen points along the way, and it kept going west. And in the last days of July, over an enormous pool of ocean running between 30 and 31 degrees Celsius, it detonated. Dolphin went from an ordinary typhoon to a Category 5 equivalent super typhoon in under 36 hours. At its peak, it carried maximum sustained winds of 165 miles per hour, about 270 kilometers per hour, with a central pressure down near 910 millibars. Satellite analysts at the Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Satellite Studies watched mesovortices spinning inside the eye, small, violent whirls within the calm center, the signature of a storm running at the outer edge of what the atmosphere can build. It was the fifth Category 5 tropical cyclone anywhere on the planet in 2026. That puts this year ahead of the pace set by 1997, which still holds the all-time global record of 12. Now here is the part that changes the entire story, and it's the part I most want you to understand, because it explains why the fiercest phase of this typhoon and the most dangerous phase are not the same phase. Dolphin could not hold its core together. Again and again, forecasters watched it go through what's called an eyewall replacement cycle. Outer rain bands wrap around, organize themselves into a second, wider ring of thunderstorms, and slowly strangle the original inner eyewall by cutting off its moisture supply. Peak wind speed drops, the eye gets bigger, the storm gets wider. Most powerful typhoons do this once, maybe twice. Dolphin did it over and over. Forecast discussions from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center flagged successive eyewall replacements as the single factor capping its intensity, and noted that each cycle left the eye larger than it had ever been before. One analyst wrote that the storm simply couldn't figure out how to keep an eye intact. So picture the change this way. A young, tight, violent typhoon works like a drill bit. Narrow, savage, terrifying at the exact point of contact, and survivable a short distance away. Every eyewall replacement traded a bit of that drill bit for something more like a paint roller. Less pressure at any one point, vastly more area covered. Dolphin has spent 2 weeks turning itself from a drill into a roller. By Friday, the meteorologist Shenyu Yang at the National Meteorological Center gave a number for how big it had become. The circulation had grown to nearly 13 times the size of Zhejiang province. In another comparison, about 1,230 times the area of Hong Kong. The Marine Forecasting Center's warning to the public was blunt and unusual. This is not only a coastal problem, people well inland should be paying attention too, because the wind field is enormous. Which brings me to the honest part, and I'd rather say it now than bury it. If you see a thumbnail somewhere tonight screaming that a Category 5 super typhoon is about to hit China, that is out of date. Dolphin was a super typhoon. It is not one now. It weakened as it moved away from the deepest ocean heat and dragged in drier air, and current guidance has it coming ashore below its peak, with a further steep decline once terrain starts tearing at it. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center expects the system to dissipate over land within roughly 60 hours of landfall. Every honest word of that should still leave you concerned, and here's why. In eastern China, the death toll from typhoons has historically not tracked with peak wind speed. It tracks with rain. It tracks with hills. And a big, slow, moisture-loaded system that comes ashore at 90 miles an hour and then wanders inland for 2 days can do far more harm than a compact monster that screams across the coast in 4 hours and dies. That's the calibration. Now let me show you what this storm has already proven it can do. Before it ever reached China, Dolphin spent days working its way along Japan's outlying islands, and each stop was a preview. Forecasters had it passing near the sparsely populated Ogasawara chain, more than 1,000 kilometers south of Tokyo, while it was still a major typhoon. Then Iwo Jima, where the storm was projected to pass close enough for a near-direct hit, while an eyewall replacement was actively widening its wind field. That's a strange sentence to write, and it's the crux of this whole storm. The weakening typhoon was becoming more dangerous to more places at the same time. Research published in Monthly Weather Review has found that a majority of Category 5 storms go through this process within 12 hours of their peak. Dolphin just refused to stop doing it. On Saturday, Dolphin's northern side scraped across Japan's Ryukyu Islands. Sustained winds near the center were measured around 162 kilometers per hour, with gusts reaching 216. In Okinawa Prefecture and in Kagoshima, more than 50,000 buildings lost power. Just over 12,000 of those were in Okinawa, and nearly 39,000 were in Kagoshima. 6 people were injured. 5 of them were elderly, and 3 of those 5 were hurt simply by falling in the wind. All Nippon Airways and Japan Airlines canceled service to the region. In Taiwan, dozens of flights were scrubbed, most of them international. Notice something about that damage report. Dolphin did not make landfall on Okinawa. It passed by. The island sat in the outer machinery of the storm, hundreds of kilometers from the center, and still lost power to 50,000 buildings. That is what a paint roller does. Now, aim that same expanded wind field at a coastline that holds one of the largest manufacturing and export economies on the planet, and add the rainfall. The rainfall forecast is the number that should stop you. Some areas of eastern Zhejiang are expected to receive more than 600 millimeters of rain from this event. In inches, that's over 23.5. Just shy of 2 feet of water falling out of the sky onto steep coastal hills. Let me put that in terms you can feel. 600 millimeters is roughly what London collects in an entire year. It's more than Los Angeles sees in 2 average years stacked together. Zhejiang could take that in about 72 hours, and forecasters warn some locations may see bursts exceeding 80 millimeters in a single hour, a bit over 3 inches an hour. The kind of intensity that overwhelms a storm drain in minutes and turns a paved street into a channel. And the rain does not stop at the coast. China Central Television has warned of heavy rainfall reaching across Zhejiang, Fujian, Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei, Anhui, Jiangsu, Henan, and Shandong. That's 9 provinces. Rain and strong wind are expected to keep affecting eastern China through the 12th of August, including Shanghai and everything around it. Forecast models also raise a second stage problem. As dolphins remains pushed north, they may run into cooler air moving down from the north, and that collision can wring even more rain out of the system over northern China than the typhoon would have produced on its own. So why does a weakening storm rain harder than a strong one? It sounds backwards until you look at what a typhoon really is. Strip away the drama, and a typhoon is a heat engine that moves water. It sits over warm ocean, evaporates enormous volumes of seawater into its inflow, spins that moisture up through towering thunderstorms, and drops it back out as rain. The peak wind speed only tells you how tightly the engine is spinning at one small point near the middle. It tells you almost nothing about how much water the machine is carrying, and Dolphin has been loading up for 2 weeks over some of the warmest water in the Pacific. Now add 3 multipliers, all of which Dolphin has. The first is size. A wider circulation reaches farther out to sea and drags in moisture across a much broader area. 13 times the area of Zhejiang means 13 times the region feeding water into the same system. The second is forward speed, and this is where the danger really compounds. Rainfall totals at any one location depend enormously on how long the rain bands sit overhead. A typhoon sprinting inland at 30 kilometers an hour dumps its water across a long smear of territory. A typhoon crawling at 13.1 that already stalled and looped offshore before committing parks that water over the same watersheds hour after hour. Same total moisture, a fraction of the area to spread it across. The third is the ground itself. The coastline Dolphin is aiming for is not flat. Behind the harbors of Zhejiang, the land rises quickly into steep, weathered hills, and when saturated ocean air is shoved up a slope, it cools and it rains harder. That is why the worst rainfall totals in Chinese typhoons so often land not on the beach but 10 or 20 kilometers inland, on the windward side of a ridge above a village that thought it was safely back from the coast. Put those 3 together and you have the entire 600 millimeter forecast in one sentence. A huge storm, moving slowly, being forced uphill. Have you ever been through a storm where the wind was the part everyone talked about, but the water was the part that actually changed your life? Tell me where and what it took from you. I read the comments on these, and the accounts from people who lived through it are usually better than anything the coverage captures. Because there is a very specific reason the water is the thing, and Eastern China learned it 7 years ago in the most brutal way possible. August 10th, 2019. Typhoon Lekima came ashore near Wenling on the Zhejiang coast, in almost exactly the corridor Dolphin is aiming for tonight. It hit as a strong typhoon, and on paper, the wind numbers were survivable for a region built to typhoon standards. Then it rained. In Yongjia County, About 130 kilometers inland from the coastal city of Wenzhou, roughly 160 millimeters of rain fell in 3 hours, 6¼ inches. That water saturated a weathered rock slope until the slope simply let go. The landslide slid into a stream and dammed it a wall of rock and soil across a small mountain river, holding back a lake that had not existed an hour earlier. Natural dams like that do not hold. This one gave way, and the water behind it came down the valley at once. Local officials reported that the river level rose 10 meters in 10 minutes. That's roughly 33 feet, a 3-story building's worth of water arriving in the time it takes to boil a kettle. 120 villagers were trapped. In one district alone, 18 people were killed. Nationwide, Lekima's toll climbed past 40 dead with more than a dozen missing, and total economic losses ran to about 18 billion yuan, in the range of $2.5 billion. Researchers who later surveyed the ground published something worth sitting with. In several of the towns hit hardest by Lekima's landslides, rainfall of that intensity had never been recorded before, and landslides had rarely been reported at all. These were communities that did not think of themselves as landslide country. The hills behind them had held for generations. Then one storm delivered a rainfall total those slopes had never been asked to absorb, and the calculation changed in a single night. That is the memory sitting behind those 4,000 people watching 7,500 slopes tonight. It is not caution for its own sake. It is a province that has already buried people because a hillside failed in the dark. So look at what China has actually done in the last 72 hours and read it as a measure of expected severity. Zhejiang raised its typhoon emergency response to level 1. That's the top of the scale, the highest tier the province has. Under it, authorities can declare an emergency flood control period and shut down outdoor activity, work, classes, businesses, transport, and roads. The National Meteorological Authority upgraded its own emergency response and lifted the typhoon warning from yellow to orange, the second highest color. On Saturday evening, the Ministry of Water Resources and the China Meteorological Administration jointly issued a red alert for flash floods covering 23 contiguous counties, cities, and districts in Zhejiang. The province suspended service on all 162 of its passenger ferry routes. It halted work at every one of its 193 offshore projects and called 474 construction vessels back to port. In Fujian, 98,900 people had been relocated out of risky areas as of Saturday evening. 55 ferry routes were suspended. 115 offshore construction sites stopped. And in the coastal city of Fuding, every single one of its 1,210 registered fishing boats was accounted for and back in harbor. Shanghai evacuated 30,300 residents from vulnerable areas, with more expected as the storm closes in, and closed more than 20 scenic sites. And then there's the aviation number, which I had to read twice. Shanghai's 2 airports plan to cancel 1,384 flights on Sunday alone, 871 at Pudong International, 513 at Hongqiao. That is close to 60% of everything scheduled to move through one of the busiest aviation hubs on the planet, deleted from the board in a single day. Ningbo Lishe International Airport shut down late Saturday night and stayed shut. Rail services across the Yangtze River Delta were suspended starting Sunday. Shanghai's Yangshan port had been cleared of vessels by late Friday, and operations were halted at Zhoushan, which happens to be the largest ship refueling hub in the country. Out on the water, the National Marine Forecasting Center held its red-level wave warning, the highest it issues, forecasting waves of 5 to 8 meters in coastal waters off Zhejiang, 16 to 26 feet. Under a separate orange warning, waves off Shanghai and northern Fujian were put at 3 to 5.5 meters. Satellite estimates put Dolphin's maximum significant wave height at over 10 meters at 1.34 feet, a wall of water taller than a 3-story house moving toward shore. Waves are only half the coastal problem. The other half is surge, and the shape of this particular coastline makes surge worse than the raw wind numbers suggest. North of the landfall corridor sits Hangzhou Bay, a broad mouth that narrows sharply as it runs inland. Water pushed into a funnel has nowhere to go but up, which is why this stretch of China is famous for a tidal bore even on calm days. Drive a typhoon's wind onto that geometry at the wrong point in the tide cycle, and the coastal water level climbs well above what the open shoreline would see. The mouths of the rivers are the pressure point. Storm surge coming up, the estuaries meets floodwater coming down them, and neither can drain. That collision is also why an enormous amount of value sits directly in the target zone. Zhejiang is one of China's largest provincial economies, a manufacturing and export center, and its combined port complex at Ningbo and Zhoushan moves a share of global container traffic that most people outside the shipping industry never think about. When Yangshan clears its berths and Zhoushan stops refueling ships, that isn't a local weather inconvenience. It's a pause in a system that the rest of the world quietly depends on, and the effects show up weeks later in places thousands of kilometers away, on shelves and in factories that have no idea a typhoon caused it. You do not empty a port that size, ground 1,400 flights and relocate 100,000 people because a storm looks impressive on satellite. You do it because the modeling says water is coming inland and you would rather move people while the roads still work. And underneath all those numbers, there are rooms. In Yuhuan, in Taizhou City, state photographers spent Saturday inside a middle school that had been converted into a temporary shelter where staff went cot to cot asking residents what they needed. That's what 100,000 relocations looks like when you zoom all the way in. Not a statistic, but a gymnasium, and an elderly man being asked whether he has his medication. The technology around that human effort has changed fast. Coastal provinces sent drones out over the water to patrol for vessels that hadn't come in. The National Marine Environmental Forecasting Center ran an artificial intelligence system built to project a storm's route, strength, and landfall characteristics 10 days ahead, which is a horizon that would have been science fiction a decade ago. Forecasters at the Joint Typhoon Warning Center were cross-checking their own guidance against an experimental machine learning model from Google DeepMind, and the agreement between those approaches is part of why the official track was issued with high confidence. None of that stops the rain. What it buys is time the difference between evacuating a valley on Friday and rescuing it on Monday. Every hour of accurate lead time converts somewhere down the chain into a person who was not in the wrong building when the slope let go. There's one more comparison worth holding on to. Xu Yinglong, chief forecaster at the National Meteorological Center, compared Dolphin to Typhoon Bavi, which struck China last month, and said Dolphin may bring stronger winds and heavier rain. That's the reference point for people on the ground. Not an abstract record, but the storm they already lived through weeks ago, and this one is expected to be worse. Now, what should you not believe over the next 48 hours? Be skeptical of any casualty figure that appears before dawn on Monday. In an event like this, the first hours after landfall are the worst possible time for accurate information. Power goes out, roads close, communities in the mountains lose contact. Numbers that circulate in that gap are almost always either invented or wildly premature. Real tolls in Chinese typhoons typically firm up over 3 to 5 days, and they usually rise as inland districts are reached, not because anyone is hiding anything, but because that's how long it takes to physically get to a cutoff valley. Be equally skeptical of anyone telling you the exact place the eye will cross. The landfall corridor between Zhoushan and Fuding covers hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Track models have been in decent agreement, but not perfect agreement. One major global model was running the storm noticeably farther south than the rest, and forecasters deliberately excluded it as an outlier before building their consensus track. That's normal, careful practice. It's also a reminder that a 100-kilometer shift in the center's position redraws which valleys get the worst of the rain. And here's the honest limit on the science itself. Track forecasting has improved enormously. China even ran an artificial intelligence system at its National Marine Environmental Forecasting Center to project Dolphin's route, strength and landfall factors out to 10 days. But rainfall forecasting for a landfalling typhoon over complex terrain remains far harder than track forecasting. Where exactly the heaviest bands set up, which specific ridge forces the air upward and squeezes out the extra 100 millimeters, whether a particular slope has enough saturation left to fail, those questions get answered by the storm, not by the model. That's the uncertainty that keeps 4,000 monitors standing on hillsides instead of sitting in an office reading output. So what does any of this mean for someone in the path right now? The clearest lesson from the last 2 decades of typhoon deaths in this region is unglamorous. Most people are not killed by the wind hitting their building. They are killed by water, and often by moving through water. Flooded underpasses, vehicles driven into a road that looks passable and isn't, rivers that come up while people are asleep, slopes that fail behind homes at 3 in the morning, which means the useful actions are equally unglamorous. If you're in a low-lying area or below a steep slope and you've been told to move, move before the peak, because during the peak the rescue services simply cannot reach you. Charge everything now on the assumption that power will fail and stay failed for a day or more. Assume the water supply may be interrupted, and when the wind drops suddenly and the sky brightens if the center passes near you, that is not the end. The back half of a typhoon arrives with the wind reversed, and it hits ground that has already been softened and loosened by the front half. More typhoon injuries happen in that second act than people expect. For everyone watching from somewhere else in the world, there's a broader signal here worth naming carefully. Dolphin is the 13th named typhoon of the Western Pacific season, and it's the 5th Category 5 storm globally this year. Forecasters have been describing this season in the context of a developing strong El Niño, a pattern that historically shifts where typhoons form and gives them more open ocean to cross before reaching land. Dolphin forming near the dateline and surviving all the way to China fits that description almost perfectly. One storm doesn't prove a pattern, and I'm not going to pretend it does. But it is exactly the kind of storm the seasonal outlooks warned about, and it's the third named system the basin has been juggling in the same week. 1 week typhoon, Kujira, was absorbed into Dolphin's circulation entirely, and another, Chanhom, spun up alongside it. Here's what I'll be watching, and what you should watch with me. First, the landfall bulletin itself. The exact position, the exact intensity at the moment the center crosses, and the storm's forward speed at that instant. A slower landfall means more rain in the same valleys. Second, the rainfall totals out of eastern Zhejiang over the next 2 days. Whether that 600 millimeter forecast verifies, undershoots, or gets exceeded will decide almost everything about how this event is remembered. Third, the geological reports. Those 7,500 monitored sites are the front line. If Zhejiang gets through this without a repeat of Yongjia, it will be because of the evacuations that happened before the rain, not the rescues that happened after. And fourth, the northern turn. Once Dolphin comes ashore, the remnant is forecast to curve poleward and push inland toward northern China, where it may run into cooler air. That collision is the second act nobody outside the region is talking about yet, and it's the reason flood control plans have already been activated as far away as Beijing. The center is hours from the coast as I record this. By the time you're watching, it may already be over land. The first images will come from Zhoushan, from Wenling, from Taizhou boats stacked against harbor walls, streets running like rivers, that particular gray light that comes with a typhoon eyewall. But the story of Dolphin won't be settled on the coast tonight. It'll be settled 48 hours from now, in the valleys, on the slopes, wherever the water decides to go after everyone has stopped filming the wind. Subscribe and turn on the bell, and I'll bring you the verified landfall data and the rainfall totals from eastern Zhejiang as soon as the observations come in, including whether those hillside monitors made the difference they were sent out there to make.